Hey guys, before we begin tonight, if you're new here, consider settling in and subscribing. It helps this little corner of the internet keep growing, and I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, so drop it in the comments whenever you get a quiet moment. Now, let's get you comfortable. Dim the lights if you can. Let your shoulders drop. Pull the blanket up just a little higher. Tonight we're going somewhere the polished version of history rarely takes us. Rome, at its height, was a city that dazzled from a distance. Marble columns catching the late afternoon sun. Senators in white togas moving through forums like pieces on a board. Aqueducts stretching for miles, carrying water across valleys as if gravity itself had been persuaded to cooperate. But beneath all of it, beneath the polished stone and the practiced dignity, ran something far less elegant. Something the empire needed just as badly as its water, and thought about far less often: waste. Imagine, for a moment, a city of over 1 million people, built centuries before anyone understood what a virus was, or a bacterium, or why a fever sometimes followed a stomachache with no warning at all. A city with no plumbing as we would recognize it, no porcelain, no flush, no privacy in the way we've come to expect it. And yet, somehow, that city functioned. People lived, laughed, argued over bread prices, fell in love, grew old, all while walking daily past open channels of sewage running just beneath their sandals. This is not the Rome of the history books, the one carved into marble busts and quoted in Latin phrases. This is the Rome of narrow alleyways where the smell told you which direction the wind was blowing. The Rome of shared stone benches with holes cut side by side, where strangers sat close enough to touch elbows while attending to the most private of business, chatting as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Because to them, it was, picture an early morning in the city, mist still clinging low over the rooftops. A baker unlatches his shutters. A cart creaks somewhere down the street, wooden wheels catching on uneven stone. And somewhere nearby, a channel of water moves quietly beneath a row of seats, carrying away what the night left behind, off toward a destination most Romans never thought to ask about. They didn't build these systems out of squeamishness, and they certainly didn't build them out of comfort in the way we'd define it. They built them out of necessity, out of a stubborn, practical determination to keep a massive, crowded city from drowning in itself. And in solving that problem, they created something stranger and more layered than most people realize: a culture where waste management became tangled up with community, with status, with superstition, and even, in certain corners, with a kind of dark comedy about the human condition. Tonight, we're going to walk through that world slowly. Not to shock you, though there will be moments that might make you shift slightly under your blanket, but to understand it. To see how a civilization capable of engineering marvels also had to grapple with something as basic, as universal, as where everybody goes when nature calls. We'll start before Rome had any solution at all. Before latrines. Before sewers. Back when the answer to this very human problem was, whatever worked, wherever you happen to be standing, let's begin there. The mist from that early morning street hadn't yet lifted when Rome was still young, still a scattering of hills above a marshy river valley, long before anyone dreamed of columns or conquest. In those earliest days, the question of where waste went had a simple answer. Wherever it landed, there were no plans yet, no engineers sketching channels beneath future streets. Just small huts clustered on the higher ground, families keeping animals close, and a river winding through the lowland that flooded more often than anyone would have liked. The Tiber was generous in some seasons and merciless in others, and the people who settled along it learned quickly that survival meant paying close attention to water. Where it came from, where it pooled, and where it needed to go, waste, in this era, was simply absorbed into the landscape. A pit dug near a dwelling. A patch of ground set slightly apart, understood without needing to be marked. Animals wandered freely through these early settlements, and their waste mixed with human waste in the same soil, the same runoff, the same slow seep toward the low-lying marsh at the base of the hills. Nobody thought of this as a system. It was simply how a small village functioned, the way it had functioned for generations before writing, before law, before the idea of Rome existed at all. But something was happening in that marsh, quietly, over centuries. The valley between the hills, the one that would one day become the beating civic heart of an empire, sat low and wet, catching runoff from every surrounding slope. Each rainfall carried a little more waste down into it. Each flood spread it a little further. The ground there grew foul, unstable, unfit for building, the problem that the villages on the hills could ignore for only so long, as their populations grew and their huts pressed closer together. Picture a child in that early settlement, picking their way along a muddy path at dusk, stepping carefully around puddles that never seemed to fully dry, the smell of the lowland drifting up faintly with the evening air. This was simply the texture of daily life. Nobody complained about it in the way we might. There was nothing yet to compare it to. It took generations of discomfort, of watching the marsh grow more unusable, of losing good grazing land to standing filth, before anyone began to seriously consider a different approach. And when that shift finally came, it didn't arrive as a grand civic vision. It arrived as a practical, almost stubborn response to a problem that had simply become too large to keep stepping around. Legend places the earliest solution in the hands of the kings who ruled before the Republic, men whose names blur slightly at the edges of myth and record. Whether the true beginning was one ambitious ruler or a slow accumulation of small efforts by many unnamed hands, the result was the same. Rome was about to attempt something no settlement in the region had tried at this scale, to take the very thing they had always simply let happen, and instead, direct it. Control it. Force it underground. That decision would shape the city for the next 1,000 years. The decision, once made, unfolded slowly, the way most lasting change tends to. Rome did not wake one morning with a finished network of sewers and seats. It began, instead, with observation, with someone noticing that a channel of moving water could carry away what a stagnant pit could not. Early Roman engineers, if we can even call them that yet, understood one thing with unusual clarity for their time. Water in motion cleanses. Water left standing festers. And so, as the city grew from scattered hilltop villages into something resembling an actual settlement, small drainage channels began to appear, following the natural slope of the land down toward the river. These weren't grand structures. Just shallow trenches, cut by hand, guiding runoff away from where people slept and gathered. It was a start. But a city cannot run on trenches alone. Not when its population begins to swell into the tens of thousands, then beyond. As Rome's ambitions grew, so did its crowding, and with crowding came a new kind of pressure, the simple, unavoidable fact that private land was becoming scarce, and not every household could claim its own patch of ground for waste. The answer that emerged was, in its own way, remarkably Roman. Practical. Communal. Built for scale rather than sentiment, public latrines began appearing near markets, near bathhouses, tucked into corners of busy streets where foot traffic never quite stopped. Long stone benches, carved with evenly spaced holes, positioned directly above channels of flowing water diverted from the city's growing water supply. No stalls. No partitions. Just a continuous run of seating, open to the room, open to whoever walked in. Picture stepping into one on a mild afternoon. Light filtering through a doorway, maybe a small window near the ceiling. The low murmur of water moving steadily beneath the stone. A few other Romans already seated along the bench, unhurried, some mid-conversation, one man reading aloud from a wax tablet to no one in particular. You take a seat among them, the stone cool even through your tunic, and simply join in. No one thought twice about it. No one looked away, embarrassed. This was where the city gathered as much as it relieved itself. The engineering behind it was quietly impressive. Channels beneath the seats were fed by a constant flow, often runoff from nearby bathhouses or aqueduct overflow. Water that had already served one purpose now serving another. Below the front of the bench, in many latrines, ran a second smaller channel, a trough where a cleaning tool could be rinsed between uses, though we'll come to the details of that particular tool shortly. What's easy to miss, looking back from where we sit now, is how radical this idea actually was. A dedicated public building, funded by the city, designed specifically for one of the most private acts a person performs, and built instead to be entirely, unapologetically shared. Rome hadn't simply solved a sanitation problem. It had folded that solution into the rhythm of daily social life, turning a basic bodily need into something closer to a civic gathering. A place where news traveled, where opinions were traded, where a stranger might become, for a few quiet minutes, something like a companion. It wouldn't take long before the design of these rooms revealed just how little privacy the Romans expected or wanted. That murmur of conversation from the latrine bench wasn't an exception. It was the point. To understand Roman sanitation, you first have to let go of an assumption we carry without realizing it, the assumption that this kind of moment is meant to be private. Walk into a well-preserved Roman latrine today, and the first thing that strikes most visitors is the absence of anything resembling a divider. No stalls. No doors. No low walls between one seat and the next. Just a continuous stretch of stone, sometimes wrapping around three sides of a room, with holes cut close enough together that neighbors would have sat almost shoulder to shoulder. For a modern visitor, this can feel almost startling. For a Roman, it would have felt like a Tuesday. Privacy, as we understand it, simply wasn't part of the equation, and it's worth sitting with why. Roman social life was, by nature, deeply communal. Bathing happened in large shared pools, often with dozens of strangers at once. Sleeping arrangements in many households involved multiple family members and servants in close quarters. Even wealth and status were performed publicly, visible in how one dressed, who one was seen with, which senator nodded to which in the forum. Against that backdrop, sharing a latrine bench wasn't an intrusion. It was simply consistent with how the whole society moved through the world, together, visibly. Without much expectation of solitude, imagine settling onto that bench on a busy morning. To your left, a merchant discussing the price of grain with the man beside him, gesturing with one hand as though mid-negotiation. To your right, an older man sitting quietly, eyes half closed, clearly using the moment as a small rest from the noise of the street outside. Directly across, if the room was built with facing benches, someone might catch your eye and simply nod, the way you'd acknowledge anyone in a shared space. No one shifted uncomfortably. No one hurried to finish and leave. There's a particular kind of dry humor in Roman graffiti and writing that survives from these spaces, references to conversations struck up mid-visit, complaints scratched into the walls about slow companions, even, in a few surviving fragments, jokes at the expense of whoever was sitting nearby. The latrine, it seems, occupied a strange social position, somewhere between necessity and gathering place, not unlike how a well in a village might double as the spot where news traveled fastest. Some larger public latrines could seat 20, 30, even more people at once, the whole spaced with a kind of practical uniformity, no seat marked as better or worse than another. Status, so carefully guarded elsewhere in Roman life, seemed to dissolve somewhat on that bench. A senator and a shopkeeper might, on a given afternoon, find themselves seated only a few feet apart, engaged in the same unremarkable business, the marble of one man's ring no more useful here than the calloused hands of the other. It raises a quiet question worth carrying forward. If a society could strip away hierarchy so completely in one particular room, what did that say about which parts of daily life the Romans actually considered worth guarding, and which parts they were content to simply share? There was one detail from that shared bench we haven't touched yet, a small wooden object, resting quietly in a shallow trough of running water at the front of the seat, waiting for its turn to be used. If the Romans stripped privacy from this particular room, they stripped something else away too, something a modern visitor might find even harder to sit with. A single tool, shared among everyone. Historians call it a tesorium, though the Romans themselves likely just called it what it was. A stick, roughly the length of a forearm, with a natural sea sponge fastened firmly to one end. Simple in construction. Utterly practical in purpose. After finishing one's business on the bench, a person would reach for it, use it, then rinse it in the flowing channel of water that ran along the base of the seats, before setting it back down for the next person to take up in turn. No one thought to bring their own. Ownership, in this context, wasn't the point. The tesorium belonged to the room the way a public well belonged to a village, the way a shared oil lamp might belong to an inn's common area. It existed to serve whoever needed it, in whatever order they arrived, and then it moved on to the next hand. Picture the scene a little more slowly now. Steam rising faintly from the channel below, if the water had been diverted from a nearby bathhouse still carrying some of its warmth. A woman finishing her turn on the bench, rinsing the sponge with an unhurried, practiced motion, the water swirling briefly cloudy before clearing again. She sets it down in a small niche or simply leans it against the stone, and without a word, an old man 2 seats down reaches for it when his own moment comes. Neither of them exchanges so much as a glance about it. This was simply Tuesday, repeated 1,000 times a day, in latrines scattered across the city. There's a particular kind of quiet intimacy in that, if you sit with it long enough. Not intimacy in the romantic sense, but something closer to trust, an assumption, embedded so deeply into daily life that no one thought to question it, that the community's shared tools were safe enough, common enough, ordinary enough to pass from stranger to stranger without hesitation. We know now, of course, what the Romans could not have known, that a shared sponge, rinsed in water that was rarely as clean as it looked, moving from body to body throughout the day, was less a convenience than a quiet, invisible risk. Parasites, bacteria, the small persistent agents of illness that wouldn't have a name for another 18 centuries, passed along that same simple stick as easily as the sponge itself. The Romans had no way to see this. Illness, when it came, arrived without explanation, attributed instead to bad air, to the displeasure of some god, to an imbalance of humors within the body. The tussorium was never suspected. It sat in its trough of water, rinsed and reused, entirely unremarkable, doing exactly what it had always done, exactly as it was designed to do. There is, in surviving Roman writing, a strange thread of dark humor around this very tool. One account, often repeated by historians studying Roman daily life, describes a captured gladiator in the arena who took his own life using a shared latrine sponge, choosing that small, undignified object over the fate that awaited him in front of the crowd. It's a jarring footnote against the otherwise mundane rhythm of latrine life, a reminder that even the most ordinary objects in Roman society carried, underneath their daily use, a kind of dark potential that history occasionally surfaces without warning. Mostly, though, the tussorium simply did its quiet work day after day, passed from hand to hand in a city that had made peace with sharing almost everything, right down to the smallest and most personal of tools. It would take many centuries, and countless more objects like it, before anyone thought to ask whether sharing quite so completely was wise. For now, the sponge rested in its trough, waiting for the next hand to reach for it. That trough of water beneath the latrine bench had to come from somewhere, and it had to go somewhere too. It's easy, sitting on that stone seat in our imagination, to think of the water as simply appearing, simply vanishing, a convenient background detail to the more visible business at hand. But beneath the streets of Rome, an entire hidden world was doing the actual work, one that most Romans walking above it never gave a second thought. Picture standing at street level on a warm afternoon, the stone beneath your sandals warmed by the sun, vendors calling out prices somewhere nearby. You would have no reason to imagine what lay just a few feet below. But if you could somehow strip away that layer of stone, you'd find channels, tunnels, culverts, a whole secondary city, dark and damp, built specifically to move water where the surface world needed it moved, and to carry away what the surface world no longer wanted. The system had grown, by this point, well beyond a few hand-dug trenches. Water arriving through the aqueducts, after serving households, fountains, and bathhouses, didn't simply disappear once it had been used. Much of it was redirected, channeled downward and outward, given a second purpose before its journey ended. This runoff, still moving, still following gravity's patient logic, became the lifeblood of the drainage network, flushing latrine channels, washing debris from side streets, keeping the lowest points of the city from collecting into the kind of standing filth that had plagued the marshy valley centuries before. Imagine a narrow access point, tucked behind a bathhouse or beneath a public building, where a worker might climb down on rare occasion, a flickering oil lamp in hand, checking for blockages. The air down there would be thick, damp, close. Sound would travel strangely, water dripping from unseen points, the distant echo of the city's ordinary noise filtering faintly through stone above. Roots from a fig tree planted decades earlier might have pushed their way through a crack in the tunnel wall, the plant above growing steadily in a courtyard while its roots, invisible to the family who owned it, quietly explored the underground channel below. These tunnels weren't uniform. Some were barely wide enough for a person to crouch through. Hand-cut and irregular, dating back to earlier, more modest phases of the city's growth. Others, built later as engineering knowledge advanced, were tall enough to walk through upright, lined with fitted stone, built to last centuries rather than decades. Layer upon layer, generation upon generation, each addition stitched onto what had come before, rarely with a single unified plan guiding the whole. Rome's underground, in this sense, mirrored Rome above ground, a city built in pieces, by different hands, across different eras, somehow cohering into something that worked, even if no one person could have explained the whole of it. Different channels served different purposes, though the boundaries blurred more than official accounts might suggest. Some carried mostly rainwater, others mostly the discharge from latrines and bathhouses, others a mixture of both, the water quality shifting depending on which neighborhood's runoff had most recently joined the flow. A channel beneath a wealthy district might carry water only slightly less pleasant than what had gone into it. A channel beneath a crowded tenement quarter, where sanitation was managed with far less care, might carry something considerably worse, the two streams eventually merging further downstream, wealth and poverty dissolving into the same current. There's something almost philosophical in that merging, if you let yourself sit with it a moment. Above ground, Rome sorted itself carefully by status, by wealth, by the particular slope of a hill that made one address more desirable than another. Below ground, none of that sorting survived. Every channel eventually fed into the same larger system, the same eventual destination, indifferent to whose household had contributed which portion of the flow, and that larger system, the one all these smaller channels were quietly feeding toward, was about to become the true marvel of Roman engineering, older than the empire itself, and far grander than anyone crouching in a narrow access tunnel might have guessed. If every smaller channel eventually found its way toward one destination, that destination had a name, and it was older than nearly anything else Rome would build over the centuries that followed. The Cloaca Maxima. The Great Sewer. A structure so foundational to the city's survival that its origins reach back before the Republic, back into the same murky, half-legendary era when kings still ruled from the hills, and the marsh in the valley below was still an unsolved problem waiting for a solution ambitious enough to match it. It began, as such things often do, with a practical need dressed in the language of something grander. That low, unstable marsh between the hills, the one that had absorbed centuries of runoff, needed to be drained before anything permanent could be built on top of it. Legend credits one of Rome's early kings with commissioning the project, though the truth is likely messier, layered, built up through successive efforts rather than a single decisive act. What began as an open drainage channel, wide and unglamorous, cutting a path through the low ground to carry water toward the river, would eventually become something far more permanent. Picture the marsh before the work began. Reeds swaying in stagnant water, the air thick with the particular smell of standing wetness, mosquitoes rising in the evening in slow, drifting clouds. Now picture, gradually, over years and then decades, laborious cutting a channel through that same ground, widening it, deepening it, guiding the trapped water toward a single directed path rather than letting it pool wherever gravity happened to leave it. Slowly, patiently, the valley began to dry. What emerged, over time, was not simply a ditch but an engineered channel, and eventually, a covered one. Stone arches rose above the flowing water, sealing it beneath the very ground that would become the Roman Forum, the beating civic heart of the empire, built quite literally on top of the solution to the problem that had once made this land unusable. There's a kind of quiet irony worth sitting with there. The most celebrated public space in the ancient world, where senators debated, where crowds gathered, where history was spoken aloud and recorded for the ages, sat directly above a river of the city's collected waste, moving steadily, silently, entirely unnoticed by everyone walking above. Imagine descending into it, if such a thing were permitted. The passage would open tall enough, in its most developed sections, for a person to stand upright, even for a small cart to pass through on inspection runs. Stone blocks fitted with a precision that would still draw admiration centuries later, the arched ceiling distributing weight evenly enough to support the enormous structures being built above. Water moved through steadily, sourced from aqueduct overflow, from rainfall, from the countless smaller channels feeding in from every direction, all merging into this single, patient current, heading always toward the same destination, the Tiber, where the accumulated burden of the city would finally be released. Diluted, carried away downstream. The engineering achievement here deserves to be named plainly, even against everything else this chapter has touched on. Building a covered channel of this scale, this early, using nothing but manual labor, careful surveying, and an intuitive understanding of gravity and water pressure, stands among the more remarkable feats of the ancient world, even if it rarely receives the same admiration as an aqueduct or a temple. Perhaps that's fitting. The Cloaca Maxima was never meant to be admired. It was meant to be forgotten, to do its work quietly beneath the feet of a city that preferred not to think about it at all, and yet, in its own understated way, this hidden channel made everything else possible. Without it, the marsh remains a marsh. Without it, the Forum has nowhere solid to stand. Without it, the population Rome would eventually swell to could never have been sustained, crowded as it was, atop ground that needed constant, invisible drainage simply to remain livable. The empire's grandest monuments, in a very real sense, owe their foundation to this unglamorous river of stone and waste, running steadily beneath everything the world came to associate with Roman greatness. Even now, centuries later, sections of the Cloaca Maxima still carry water beneath the modern city above it, a structure so soundly built that it has quietly outlasted the empire that gave it purpose. For all the engineering we've just walked through, the Cloaca Maxima and its network of feeding channels solved one problem while quietly creating another, one no amount of stone and gravity could fully resolve. Smell. It seeped upward, unavoidable, woven into the very air of the city in a way that modern visitors, stepping off a train into a city with modern plumbing, could scarcely imagine. Consider what the Roman nose contended with on an ordinary day. Latrine channels running just beneath busy streets, carrying waste toward the great sewer, but not instantly, not without lingering, especially on days when the water ran low. Open-air markets selling fish, their scent mixing freely with whatever drifted up from a nearby drain. Tanneries, where hides were cured using urine collected from public latrines, a detail we'll return to later, filling entire districts with a smell sharp enough to make even a hardened Roman wrinkle their nose. Layer all of this together, block by block, across a city of over 1 million people, and you begin to understand that Rome, however magnificent it appeared from a distance, was, up close, an assault on the senses in ways its marble facades never let on. Picture walking through a crowded quarter near the Forum on a warm afternoon, the kind of heat that makes every scent linger a little longer in the still air. A woman ahead of you presses a small cloth, scented faintly with crushed herbs. Briefly to her nose as she passes a side alley, then lowers it again without breaking her stride, the gesture so practiced it barely registers as deliberate. This was simply how one moved through certain streets. Not with disgust exactly, but with a kind of quiet, habitual management, the way someone today might instinctively step around a puddle without pausing to think about why. The Romans, remarkably, developed an entire vocabulary and social etiquette around managing smell without ever solving its source. Wealthier households burned incense freely, not purely for ceremony but as a practical counter to whatever drifted in from the street below. Perfumed oils, applied liberally after bathing, served a dual purpose: luxury, certainly, but also a kind of personal shield against a city that never quite smelled clean. Even public spaces made concessions. Some bathhouses positioned their entrances carefully, angled away from prevailing winds that might otherwise carry an unwelcome draft from a nearby latrine, and yet, curiously, the Romans rarely wrote about the smell with the horror a modern account might expect. It surfaces in their literature more often as background texture than complaint, mentioned in passing the way we might mention traffic noise or a neighbor's barking dog, an irritation, certainly, but not a crisis, not something worth dwelling on at length. This tells us something quietly important about how the Romans understood their own city. They didn't measure Rome against some imagined odorless ideal. They measured it against what came before, against smaller settlements with even less infrastructure, against the alternative of no drainage at all. By that comparison, the Rome they lived in, smell and all, represented genuine progress. There's a particular scene worth imagining here, one that captures this quiet acceptance better than any single fact could. An elderly senator, finishing his business in a public latrine, rises unhurried, adjusts his toga, and steps back out into a street thick with the mingled scent of the tannery 2 doors down and the fish market just beyond it. He doesn't pause. He doesn't grimace. He simply continues on toward the forum, already turning his thoughts to the debate awaiting him, the smell already fading from his attention the way it faded from everyone's, day after day, in a city that had long since stopped noticing what it could not change. It's worth remembering, too, that we ourselves live inside our own version of this same quiet negotiation, tolerating things about our modern world that a future visitor might find equally remarkable, a reminder that every era learns to live inside whatever compromise its engineering has managed to solve, and simply calls it normal. That senator, continuing on toward the forum, unhurried, unbothered, carried with him something worth pausing on, the sense that the latrine he'd just left wasn't merely a stop along his day, but a small, ordinary part of the social fabric he moved through constantly. To understand Roman daily life fully, we have to look at these shared benches not just as sanitation, but as something closer to a gathering place, woven into the rhythm of how news moved, how relationships were maintained, how a city this large managed to still feel, in certain corners, almost like a village. Think for a moment about where conversation naturally happens in any society. The market stall, where haggling opens the door to gossip. The well, where women once gathered to draw water and exchange news in the same unhurried breath. The barber shop, then as now, a place where opinions flowed as freely as the actual haircuts. Rome added its latrines to this list, and once you understand why, it stops feeling strange at all. These were rooms without hurry. Unlike a market stall, where a line might be forming behind you, or a workshop, where a task waited to be finished, a latrine visit had no external pressure demanding speed. A person could sit, finish their business, and simply remain a few minutes longer, chatting with whoever happened to occupy the neighboring seat. There was nowhere else more pressing to be, not for these few minutes. And Romans seem to have understood this instinctively, treating the pause as an opportunity rather than an inconvenience. Picture a mid-morning scene in one of the larger public latrines near the markets. A cloth merchant, still faintly dusted with the fibers of his trade, sits beside a mason whose hands carry the permanent grey tint of stone dust worked into his skin over years. They've likely never spoken before this morning, may never speak again after it, and yet for these few minutes, conversation flows easily between them. The price of wheat this season, a rumor about a chariot race the following week, a complaint about a magistrate's latest decision that has apparently irritated half the district. Class distinctions, so carefully maintained everywhere else in Roman life, soften here, if only slightly. If only temporarily. Political news, in particular, seemed to travel through these rooms with unusual speed. A decision made in the Senate that morning might reach the latrines by early afternoon, passed from citizen to citizen faster than any official announcement could manage, filtered and reshaped slightly with each retelling, the way rumor always is. Historians studying surviving graffiti from these spaces have found fragments of political commentary scratched directly into the walls, complaints, jokes at a public figure's expense, occasionally a crude drawing accompanying the text. The latrine, it turns out, functioned as an informal bulletin board as much as a functional necessity. A place where the city's true, unfiltered opinion of itself could be found scratched into stone, far more honest than anything spoken aloud in the forum. There's a gentle, human warmth in this, if you let yourself sit with it. In a city this vast, this stratified, this driven by ambition and status at nearly every turn, the latrine offered something rare, a room where the usual rules softened, if only for a few minutes, where a stranger might become, briefly, something like company. An old man who lived alone might find, in his daily visit to the public latrine, one of the only reliable conversations of his day, a small ritual of connection tucked into an otherwise ordinary errand. It's worth imagining, too, the quieter version of this scene. Not every visit was filled with lively conversation. Sometimes it was simply two people, sitting in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the water moving steadily beneath them, the room holding a kind of unspoken understanding that not every shared space requires words to feel less lonely. By the time that Senator stepped back out into the street, he carried with him not just the physical relief of the visit, but perhaps a fragment of gossip, a piece of news. A small thread of connection with someone whose name he'd likely never learn, proof that even the most utilitarian corners of Roman life had found a way to feel, in their own unassuming manner, faintly human. That old man who found company on the bench, that senator who left carrying a scrap of gossip alongside his thoughts, their world tells only half the truth. Because not every Roman, however comfortable his fortune, ever set foot in a public latrine. And the reasons behind that absence uncover something sharper about how rank-shaped even the plainest details of ordinary living. Money in Rome purchased separation, and separation, more than almost anything else, defined ease. The finest homes, the domus of senators and traders who'd built their standing through commerce or inherited land, frequently tucked a private facility into a back corner near the kitchen, linked where possible into the same underground network that served the streets outside. A personal seat, carved sometimes from stone, sometimes fitted with timber, positioned discreetly enough that a dinner guest might never notice it existed. The value here had little to do with cleanliness. A household able to divert its own share of aqueduct water, able to maintain a direct link to the city's drainage system rather than depending on a shared bench down the road, was making an unmistakable declaration about its rank. The plumbing became a kind of signal, invisible to strangers passing by, yet perfectly legible to anyone who understood what such a connection cost. Consider two homes along the same road. One, a cramped set of rented rooms above a shop, its occupants filing out each dawn to join others at the public bench several streets away, trading nods with familiar neighbors on the walk. The other, a spacious residence set back behind a walled courtyard, its master rising to relieve himself steps from where he slept, never joining the shared current of the street below. Both arrive, eventually, at the same ordinary outcome. Yet the road each traveled to reach it reveals an entirely different life. Even inside the grandest domus, though, private rarely meant untouched by other eyes. Household servants passed through these spaces constantly, attending to their master's needs without the boundaries that governed a guest or a visiting relative. A senator's personal facility, then, offered privacy only from the world beyond his walls, never from the household surrounding him, a distinction that says a great deal about where Romans actually drew the line between what belonged to everyone and what belonged only to oneself. There's a strange twist worth pausing on. The public bench, crowded and constant with strangers, gave something the private seat never managed to offer: talk. Rumor, a small daily bond with people outside one's own walls. Wealth, in buying isolation, quietly cost a man that thread of company. Some noticed the trade and pushed back against it. A handful of accounts describe rich citizens who kept returning to the crowded bench anyway, pulled not by need but by companionship, choosing the noise of strangers over the hush their fortune could easily have bought instead. Most households, naturally, had no such choice to make. For the bulk of the population, packed into insulae, the tall, often shoddily built apartment blocks that housed the majority of the city, a private facility was never on offer at all. These structures rarely tied into the drainage network in any real sense, leaving residents dependent on chamber pots, shared arrangements, or a walk to the nearest bench, regardless of hour or weather. The gulf between a senator's private stone seat and a laborious chamber pot, tucked into the corner of a rented room barely large enough to turn around in, measured something far greater than plumbing. It measured the full distance between how differently Rome allowed its people to exist. And that gulf, as we're about to discover, only widens once we step past the courtyard walls and into those crowded apartment blocks themselves, where the real question wasn't which bench to choose, but what a person did when no bench, public or private, sat anywhere within reach. That gulf we just crossed, between a senator's private stone seat and a laborious cramped rented room, finds its clearest shape once we step inside an insula and look at what actually sat in the corner. For most Romans, the answer to nature's call after dark, or after climbing 4 or 5 flights of narrow stairs, wasn't a bench at all. It was a simple ceramic pot, kept close at hand, doing quietly at home what the public latrine did on a grander scale down the street. These pots varied about as much as the households that owned them. A modest clay vessel, unglazed and plain, sat in the corner of a single rented room shared by an entire family. A slightly finer version, sometimes glazed, sometimes fitted with a lid, might appear in a household with a bit more coin to spare, tucked discreetly behind a curtain or a low wooden screen. In wealthier homes, even where a private latrine existed near the kitchen, a chamber pot often still sat beside the bed, sparing the household the inconvenience of a nighttime walk across a dark, unheated house. Consider a winter night in one of those upper-floor apartments, the kind stacked 5 stories above a busy street, wind pressing thin against shuttered windows. A woman wakes in the dark, reaches instinctively for the pot kept near the sleeping mat, uses it without needing to light a lamp, then settles back under a woolen blanket. The whole motion practiced and unremarkable, repeated the same way most nights of her life. Climbing down 4 flights of unlit stairs, crossing a street that offered no guarantee of safety after dark, simply wasn't worth the alternative. The pot solved that problem before it could even become one. Emptying it, though, was where the real complication began, and we'll walk through the fuller, messier version of that story shortly. For now, it's enough to know that the pot didn't stay full for long. Someone, usually whoever held the lowest standing in the household, whether a servant, a child, or simply whoever happened to wake first, carried it toward a window, toward a designated corner of a courtyard, toward wherever custom in that particular building dictated waste should go. In grander homes, servants managed this task as one small part of a much longer list of daily duties, the pot's contents disappearing from a resident's awareness almost as soon as it left their hands. There's a specific kind of intimacy in the chamber pot that the public latrine, for all its social warmth, never quite offered. This was private in the truest sense, used alone, in darkness, without conversation or company. And yet it sat only a few feet from where an entire family slept, ate, argued, and lived their whole compressed existence within four narrow walls. Privacy, in the insula, wasn't really about being unseen. It was about function folding quietly into the same cramped space as everything else, no separate room possible when one room was often all a family had. Some households kept a designated pot for each family member, spaced along a wall or tucked into separate corners. Others made do with a single vessel, passed in turn as needed, not unlike the shared latrine bench a few streets over, just carried indoors, shrunk down to fit a single crowded room. The logic hadn't really changed. Only the scale, and the walls around it. Children grew up around this arrangement without ever knowing another way of living. A boy of 6 or 7, woken in the night by the sound of his mother rising to use the pot in the corner, would think nothing of it, drift back to sleep within moments, the small domestic sound as ordinary to him as a cart creaking somewhere below the window. This was simply the texture of home, in a city where privacy had never quite meant what we've since decided it should mean. By morning, the pot's contents needed somewhere to go, and the path they took from that quiet corner out into the wider city was neither simple nor, in truth, particularly pleasant for whoever lived below. That quiet path from a bedside pot to a corner of the courtyard didn't end there, and for many households, it didn't end gently either. Morning in an insula brought a particular ritual, one repeated across the city's cramped upper floors, and it involved a decision every resident faced sooner or later, what to do with a night's accumulation when the nearest proper drain sat 5 flights down, and the stairs were dark, and the courtyard corner was already crowded with everyone else's waste from the night before. Some residents made the walk anyway, carrying the pot down narrow stairwells worn smooth by generations of feet, out into the street or courtyard where a designated channel, however modest, waited to receive it. This was the proper way, the expected way, the way that kept a building's shared spaces from turning foul within days. But proper wasn't always practical, especially on the highest floors, especially in winter, especially when a resident had somewhere to be and little patience for the climb, so some simply opened a window instead. Picture a narrow street below one of these towering apartment blocks, early morning light barely reaching the ground between buildings packed close enough to nearly touch. A pedestrian below, hurrying toward the market with a basket under one arm, learns to walk with a kind of instinctive wariness near certain buildings, as flicking upward at the sound of a shutter creaking open above. Sometimes a shouted warning came first, a courtesy extended by whoever was about to empty their pot, giving anyone below a moment to step clear. Sometimes it didn't. Roman law, in fact, took this hazard seriously enough to address it directly, holding the resident of an apartment liable for injury or damage caused by anything thrown or poured from a window, whether the culprit could be identified or not. An entire body of legal reasoning grew up around this single, ordinary indignity of city life. The smell alone marked certain streets as ones to avoid, or at least to hurry through, particularly beneath buildings known for careless residents. Neighbors complained about each other constantly, informal reputations forming around which household consistently failed to give warning, which stairwell reeked worst by midday, which courtyard corner had become, through sheer repeated use, something closer to an open pit than a designated space. This wasn't universal recklessness. Many residents were conscientious, careful, making the long walk down rather than risk a neighbor's anger or a stranger's injury. But a crowded city with thin enforcement and exhausted, overworked residents will always produce its share of shortcuts. And Rome was no exception. Consider, too, the position of a street vendor setting up shop each morning beneath one of these buildings, arranging goods on a simple stall, glancing upward out of long habit before choosing exactly where to place his cart. He'd learned, through experience rather than any posted warning, which windows to watch, which hours carried the greatest risk, which side of the street stayed marginally safer through the working day. This kind of localized, hard-won knowledge passed between neighbors and shopkeepers the way any survival skill does, quietly, through repetition, until avoiding a particular stretch of pavement became as automatic as checking for traffic. Municipal efforts to manage this problem shifted over the centuries, some periods bringing stricter enforcement, designated collection points, even workers tasked with clearing waste from streets on a regular schedule. Other periods saw enforcement lapse, the burden falling back onto residents' individual conscience, or lack of it. The tension never fully resolved. A city this large, this vertically stacked, always outpaced whatever system tried to keep its streets clean, waste finding its way downward through whatever gap in vigilance a given month happened to offer, and yet, for all this apparent chaos, something was quietly working underneath it. Even waste dumped carelessly from a window eventually found its way, through runoff and rain and the natural slope of the street, toward the same channels feeding the greater system below, the one running steadily beneath the forum, carrying the city's accumulated burden toward the river regardless of whether it arrived by careful hand or careless toss. That underground system, patient and indifferent to the manner of its filling, still had its own dangers waiting within it. Dangers that had nothing to do with smell or inconvenience at all. That patient underground current, indifferent to how it was filled, carried more than the city ever realized. Beneath the smell, beneath the daily inconvenience, ran something invisible, something the Romans had no instrument to detect and no framework to even suspect. The Cloaca Maxima and its feeding channels, for all their engineering triumph, were also a vast, unintentional highway for illness, moving quietly through a population that had no way of tracing sickness back to its true source. Consider what actually flowed through those tunnels day after day. Human waste, animal waste, runoff from tanneries, discarded scraps from the markets above, all mingling in a slow current that occasionally slowed further. Pooled, stagnated in sections where the slope flattened or a blockage formed unnoticed. Warm, damp, dark, nutrient-rich, that environment offered ideal conditions for exactly the kind of organisms Rome had no name for, no concept of, nothing but the vague, resigned belief that illness arrived through bad air or divine displeasure whenever it struck. Picture a physician of the era, called to attend a family suffering from violent stomach illness, 3 members of a household struck within days of each other. He'd examine the sick, perhaps prescribe rest, a particular diet, an offering left at a household shrine. He would never think to ask what water the family drank, never consider that the well they relied on sat only a short distance from a leaking channel. Never suspect that the very system built to protect the city's health might, in certain conditions, be quietly undermining it instead. The connection between contaminated water and illness simply didn't exist yet, not as a concept anyone could reach for. Outbreaks moved through Roman neighborhoods with a pattern that, looking back now, seems almost readable. Certain districts suffered more than others, generally the lower, more crowded quarters where drainage ran slower, where wells sat closer to leaking channels, where poverty meant less access to the cleaner water diverted toward wealthier homes. A family living above a shop in one of these districts might watch illness pass through their building room by room, never once suspecting the shared well in the courtyard below, the same well every resident drew from daily without a second thought. There's a particular scene worth imagining here. A mother filling a jug at a courtyard well on an ordinary morning. Unaware that a crack in the channel running beneath the building, a crack no one had noticed or repaired in months, had been slowly seeping into the very water she now carried up the stairs to her family. She'd have no reason for suspicion. The water looked clear enough, tasted much the way it always had. The danger sat entirely outside what her senses could detect, outside anything her era's understanding of the body could explain. Even the sewage system's own workers, the men who occasionally descended into those tunnels to clear blockages or inspect crumbling sections, faced risks they couldn't have named. Prolonged exposure to that damp, enclosed air, to whatever organisms thrived in the slow-moving current beneath them, likely shortened lives and caused illnesses attributed, again, to entirely wrong explanations. A cough that lingered for months. A fever that returned each winter. These were simply accepted as the price certain trades carried, the way a soldier accepted the risk of the battlefield, without any clear understanding of what, precisely, was doing the damage. And yet, here's the quiet paradox worth sitting with. For all this hidden danger, Rome's sanitation system, on balance, likely prevented far more illness than it caused. A city without any drainage at all, without the Cloaca Maxima's patient current carrying waste away from where people lived, would have suffered outbreaks on a scale the actual city, imperfect as its system was, largely managed to avoid. The engineers who built these channels weren't wrong to build them. They simply couldn't have known that their solution carried its own smaller, more hidden cost, folded invisibly into the very success of what they'd achieved. It would take nearly 2,000 years before anyone finally understood the connection these Romans lived inside without ever perceiving, before someone traced illness back to water, back to contamination, back to the same patient channels that had carried Rome's burden for so many centuries in silence. That worker descending into the damp channel carried a risk far more immediate than the slow illness we've just walked through. Disease took weeks, months, sometimes years to reveal itself. This other danger could take a life in minutes, sometimes seconds, and it left no mark on the body to explain what had happened. Enclosed, organic matter breaking down in warm, still air produces gases. Rome's sewage workers had no scientific language for this, no way to name what accumulated in poorly ventilated stretches of tunnel, in the deeper corners of a public latrines channel, in any confined space where waste sat too long without fresh air reaching it. They only knew, through hard experience passed down as caution rather than explanation, that certain places felt wrong to enter. A heaviness in the air. A faint dizziness that struck before a person fully understood why. Sometimes, worse, picture a narrow access shaft leading down from a courtyard, the kind used occasionally to reach a blocked section of channel below. A worker lowers himself in, oil lamp held ahead of him, and within moments the flame dims, sputters, threatens to go out entirely, starved of something in the air he can't see or name. This, if he'd learned his trade properly, was the signal to climb back out immediately, without pause, without finishing whatever task had brought him down there. The lamp knew before the man did. A dying flame in a Roman sewer tunnel meant the air itself no longer held enough to sustain fire. And if it couldn't sustain fire, it very likely couldn't sustain a person either. Not every worker heeded that warning in time, or noticed it at all in a poorly lit, unfamiliar section of tunnel. Accounts from the period, scattered and incomplete as they are, reference sudden deaths tied to work in these enclosed spaces, deaths that struck without visible cause, without wound or fever, a man simply collapsing where he stood and never rising again. Families left behind had no framework for understanding what had happened, no name for the invisible danger that had taken someone healthy and left him lifeless within a confined stretch of stone. Some attributed it to angry spirits said to inhabit the underground, punishing those who disturbed the depths beneath the city. Others simply called it bad luck, an occupational hazard accepted the way any dangerous trade accepts its casualties, without expecting a fuller explanation. Public latrines themselves carried a smaller version of this same risk, particularly in warmer months when the channels beneath ran slower, when waste lingered longer before the water finally carried it onward. A person seated on the bench for an extended period, in a poorly ventilated room, might feel an unexplained lightheadedness, attribute it to the heat, to hunger, to nothing at all, and simply rise, step outside, and feel better within moments in the open air. Most experiences never went further than this. But the ingredients for something worse sat there regardless. Present in trace amounts nearly everywhere, waste accumulated in an enclosed space, occasionally concentrating enough, under the wrong conditions, to become genuinely dangerous. There's a particular tension worth sitting with here, one that runs through nearly everything we've covered so far. Rome built a system remarkable for its era, one that solved an enormous civic problem through patient engineering and centuries of accumulated effort. And yet that same system, however impressive, held small pockets of danger folded invisibly into its success, dangers the Romans could sense, could develop caution around, could pass down as instinct and folk wisdom, but never truly understand. A dimming lamp flame became their only instrument, their only early warning, standing in for a science that wouldn't exist for many centuries still. Workers developed their own quiet rituals in response. Some lowering a caged bird ahead of themselves into deep shafts, watching to see whether it continued singing or fell suddenly silent, an imperfect but often effective method of sensing danger before a person followed the same path down. It wouldn't be the last time in history that someone found a clever, indirect way to detect a threat they couldn't see, name, or fully explain, relying instead on some other living thing's more sensitive reaction to warn them first. By the time evening settled over the city, most of these dangers had passed unnoticed by the vast majority of Romans going about their day above ground, entirely unaware of what quiet risks moved beneath their feet, waiting in the dark for whoever happened to climb down and disturb them. That caged bird, held over a dark shaft to test the unseen air below, points toward something larger running through this whole underground world. Where Roman understanding stopped, belief simply stepped in to fill the gap. And nowhere did belief grow stranger, or more oddly specific, than around the latrine itself. Fortuna sat at the center of it. Not the grand, temple-worshipped Fortuna invoked before battles or elections, but a smaller, more domestic version of her, one Roman seemed to feel was watching, of all places, over the latrine. Small shrines or simple inscriptions dedicated to Fortuna appeared in public latrines across the city, tucked into a wall niche or carved directly above the bench. And citizens would sometimes offer a quiet word to her before sitting down, treating even this most ordinary act as one worth a moment's acknowledgement to fate. Consider why. A latrine, particularly a public one, was in a real sense a vulnerable place. A person seated there had set down their guard, was momentarily distracted, occupied, unable to react quickly to danger. Robbery near latrines wasn't unheard of, nor was simple bad luck of a more mundane sort, a dropped coin lost through the channel below, never to be recovered. Invoking Fortuna here wasn't purely superstition detached from reason. It reflected a genuine, practical awareness that this particular moment carried its own small risks. One's worth a brief nod toward luck before settling onto the bench. Picture a woman entering a public latrine on a busy afternoon, pausing just a heartbeat at the small niche near the entrance, murmuring something too quiet to catch, fingers brushing lightly against the worn stone where countless hands had touched before hers. Then she moves on, takes her seat among the others, the gesture already fading from her thoughts, as automatic and unremarkable to her as touching a door frame out of habit might be to someone today. Other beliefs ran darker, tangled up with the same underground world that held those invisible gases and quiet occupational dangers. Some Romans held a genuine unease about the sewers themselves, believing the tunnels beneath the city might house spirits. Restless presences displaced by the very construction that had driven water and waste through what had once been undisturbed earth. Workers who spent their days in that damp dark occasionally spoke, in the fragments that survive, of unexplained sounds, sudden cold patches, a sense of being watched in tunnels where no other living person could possibly be. Whether these were the product of genuine belief, workplace storytelling passed down to unnerved newcomers, or some mixture of both, the fear itself was real enough to shape behavior, certain sections of tunnel avoided when possible, certain hours considered worse than others for descending. There's a particular irony folded into all this. The same culture capable of engineering the cloaca maxima, of solving a civic problem through patient calculation and centuries of accumulated technical skill, still reached instinctively for a goddess and a whispered word whenever faced with the ordinary vulnerability of sitting down in a public room. Rationality and superstition sat side by side in the Roman mind without much apparent tension between them, one governing the visible mechanics of daily life, the other quietly managing everything engineering couldn't reach or explain. Graffiti from surviving latrines occasionally reveals this same blend in miniature. Alongside political jokes and complaints about slow companions. A few fragments record something closer to a plea, a request for luck, a small warding phrase scratched into stone by someone who wanted just a little extra protection led onto an otherwise unremarkable visit. These weren't formal prayers. They read more like habit, like reflex, the kind of small ritual a person repeats without fully examining why, simply because it has always felt right to do so. By the time that woman rose from the bench and stepped back into the street, Fortuna's brief acknowledgement already forgotten beneath the day's other concerns, she carried forward a tradition older than she likely realized, one that would continue quietly for centuries, long after the empire that built these latrines had crumbled into ruin around them. Fortuna's small shrine, tucked quietly near a latrine entrance, wasn't the only place where sanitation and social ritual overlapped. A short walk from most public latrines stood a building where this overlap grew even richer, even more central to daily Roman life. The bathhouse. And within its walls, the latrine took on a slightly different character, woven into a much larger routine of leisure, cleansing, and unhurried socializing. Roman bathhouses operated on a scale that's easy to underestimate from a distance. The largest imperial baths could hold thousands of visitors at once, offering pools of varying temperature, exercise courts, libraries, even gardens, all under one sprawling roof or set of connected structures. Latrines fit naturally into this design, typically positioned near the entrance or close to the changing rooms, convenient for visitors arriving or departing, close enough to the bathhouse's water supply that runoff from the pools themselves could be redirected to flush the latrine channels below. This arrangement solved a practical problem elegantly. Bathhouse water, having already served its primary purpose of cleansing thousands of bathers throughout the day, didn't simply drain away and disappear. Engineers channeled it onward, giving it a second life beneath the latrine benches, the same steady flow that had once filled a heated pool now carrying waste toward the larger sewer system instead. Nothing in Roman infrastructure, it seems, was ever allowed to serve just one purpose if a second use could be squeezed from it. A visitor's day at the baths followed a fairly consistent rhythm, and the latrine often marked both the beginning and the end of it. Arriving in the late afternoon, the traditional hour for bathing among those with leisure to spare, a citizen might stop first at the latrine before undressing, a practical errand tucked into the transition between the busy street outside and the calmer world within. Hours later, after moving through the cold room, the warm room, the hot steam-filled chamber, after oiling the skin and having it scraped clean with a curved metal strigil, after floating in a heated pool while discussing politics with acquaintances half submerged beside him, that same citizen might stop once more at the latrine on his way out. The visit bookending an afternoon devoted entirely to the body's comfort, the latrines within these grand bathhouses tended toward the more elaborate end of Roman design. Marble seating in wealthier establishments, sometimes decorative mosaics on the floor beneath, occasionally even piped water specifically for washing hands afterward, a small luxury not every public latrine elsewhere in the city could offer. The baths of Caracalla, among the grandest ever built, included latrine facilities substantial enough to serve the thousands who might pass through on a single busy day, engineered with the same ambition and scale as the pools and courtyards surrounding them. Conversation here carried a slightly different flavor than at a market district latrine. Bathhouse visitors tended to linger longer, unhurried by the errands that might press on someone using a latrine near a busy street stall. A senator relaxing after a long soak, a merchant discussing a shipment delayed at port, a young man recently arrived from the provinces still adjusting to the particular rhythms of city life, all might find themselves seated together, the conversation drifting easily between politics, gossip, philosophy, and whatever small complaint the day had produced, the setting itself encouraging a kind of leisurely candor harder to summon in a more rushed corner of the city. Slaves and attendants moved constantly through these spaces too, tending to towels, restocking oil, occasionally cleaning the latrine benches between waves of visitors, their presence a quiet reminder that even this most communal, egalitarian-seeming room still depended on invisible labor to keep functioning smoothly. The bathers relaxing on the bench rarely gave this labor much thought, the way comfort rarely invites reflection on what makes it possible. By the time a citizen finally stepped back out into the cooling evening air, bathed, oiled, rested, and relieved in every sense the day had offered, the bathhouse latrine had already faded into the background of the experience. One small practical stop within a much larger ritual of leisure that Roman society had elevated into something close to an art form. That quiet labor keeping the bathhouse latrine clean stood in sharp contrast to what happened out on the ordinary street, where no attendant waited to tidy up after a careless resident. Rome, for all its communal spirit around shared benches and public bathing, still had to reckon with the darker side of that same openness. Where people shared space this freely, someone eventually had to decide what counted as acceptable behavior, and what crossed into something the law needed to address, Roman authorities took public sanitation more seriously than a modern observer might expect from a city otherwise so casual about privacy. Magistrates called aediles held direct responsibility for the condition of the streets. Tasked with everything from maintaining public buildings to policing exactly the kind of window dumping and street fouling we walked through earlier. Their authority carried real teeth. Fines could be levied against a household caught disposing of waste improperly, and in more serious cases involving injury, compensation could be demanded from whoever had caused harm by careless disposal from above. The legal reasoning behind this grew surprisingly sophisticated over time. Roman jurists debated questions that sound almost modern in their careful specificity. If waste thrown from a shared apartment building injured a passerby, who bore responsibility, the individual resident or the building's owner? What if the culprit couldn't be identified at all? Lost among dozens of possible windows above a busy street? Legal texts from the era address this exact scenario, establishing that liability could fall on the building's occupants collectively when no single person could be named, a solution practical enough to actually function in a city as densely packed as Rome had become. Consider the aedile making his rounds through a market district on an ordinary morning, trailed by an assistant carrying notes on recent complaints. A shopkeeper gestures toward a nearby alley, describing waste dumped there repeatedly over the past week, the smell driving away customers who might otherwise linger at his stall. The aedile makes note of the building above, perhaps issues a formal warning, perhaps a fine if the complaint proves to be a repeated offense rather than a single lapse. This wasn't glamorous work, nothing that made its way into the grand histories of conquest and politics, but it represented a genuine, ongoing effort to keep an enormous city functioning at a basic, livable level. Punishments extended beyond simple fines in certain cases. Someone caught deliberately fouling a public latrine, damaging its facilities, or behaving in ways that disrupted its communal function might face penalties calibrated to the offense, a system that treated these shared spaces as genuine civic property worth protecting, not merely convenient afterthoughts in the city's infrastructure. The underlying logic mirrored how Rome treated other public resources. Aqueducts, roads, and marketplaces all carried legal protections against damage or misuse, and latrines, however humble their function, fell under this same broader umbrella of civic responsibility. Enforcement, admittedly, varied considerably depending on the era and the particular emperor or magistrate overseeing a given district. Some periods saw vigorous attention paid to sanitation, streets kept relatively clear through diligent oversight. Other stretches of Roman history saw this attention lapse considerably, the burden of upkeep falling unevenly onto whichever neighborhoods happened to have conscientious residents willing to police themselves without official pressure. A poorer quarter, lacking the influence to demand consistent enforcement, often bore the worst of this inconsistency, streets there growing fouler while wealthier districts nearby received closer attention from officials eager to keep the areas frequented by senators and merchants presentable. There's something worth noting in how this legal framework reveals Roman priorities more broadly. A society willing to draft careful legislation around chamber pot disposal, willing to assign an entire class of magistrate to oversee public cleanliness, understood on some level that civilization itself depended on managing these unglamorous, unavoidable realities of dense communal living. The senators debating grand policy in the forum owed a debt, whether they acknowledged it or not, to the aediles quietly enforcing fines against careless window dumpers a few streets away, the two forms of governance equally necessary to keeping the city functioning as a coherent whole. By evening, the aediles' rounds complete for the day, the streets he'd walked carried at least the appearance of order, even if tomorrow would likely bring a fresh set of complaints, a fresh set of violations, the same patient cycle repeating itself as it had for generations before him, and would continue for generations still to come. That patient cycle of enforcement and violation, repeating itself for generations, eventually came to an end the way all of Rome's daily rhythms did, swallowed by centuries, buried beneath layers of collapse and rebuilding and the slow accumulation of time. But something unexpected survived. The channels themselves, the latrines, the drains, all that unglamorous infrastructure nobody thought worth celebrating in its own era, left behind a kind of record no monument or written text ever could. Archaeologists working sites across the old empire have spent decades sifting through exactly this material, the debris caught in ancient drains and cesspits. And what they found offers something closer to an honest snapshot of ordinary Roman life than almost any other source available. Waste, it turns out, preserves remarkably well in the right conditions, sealed away from air and light in damp, undisturbed channels for nearly 2,000 years, waiting for a trowel and a patient researcher to finally bring it back into the light. Consider what a single well-preserved latrine drain can reveal. Seeds, still identifiable after all this time, showing precisely what fruits and grains a household or neighborhood actually ate, not what a wealthy author claimed was fashionable to eat, but what genuinely passed through ordinary digestive systems on an average week. Fish bones, too small and fragile to survive most other archaeological contexts, sometimes turn up intact in these sealed, oxygen-poor environments, offering researchers a clearer picture of Roman diet than kitchen remains alone could ever provide. Parasite eggs represent perhaps the most revealing discovery of all, preserved in quantity significant enough for researchers to draw genuine conclusions about public health in the ancient world. Whipworm, roundworm, and other intestinal parasites appear consistently across sites, evidence supporting exactly the invisible danger we walked through several chapters back, the quiet contamination cycling through Rome's water and food supply that no one at the time could see or explain. These findings let modern researchers do something no Roman physician ever could: trace disease back to its actual biological cause rather than attributing it to bad air or divine displeasure, beyond the purely dietary and medical evidence. Drains have surrendered smaller, more personal artifacts too. Coins, dropped through the gap in a latrine seat and never retrieved, sometimes recovered in surprising quantities from beneath public benches. Rings, small tools, fragments of jewelry, occasionally even a stray die or gaming piece, lost during an idle moment of conversation on the bench and left to sink into the current below. Each object represents an unremarkable little accident from someone's ordinary day, preserved by circumstance into a small archaeological treasure 2 millennia later. Picture the excavation itself, researchers working carefully through layers of compacted, ancient debris, each layer representing months or years of accumulated deposit. Cataloging seeds and bone fragments with the same rigor another team might apply to a temple's marble inscriptions. There's a particular humility in this kind of work, a willingness to find genuine historical value in what most people, ancient or modern, would consider the least dignified material imaginable. And yet these researchers would argue, correctly, that this material tells us more about how ordinary Romans actually lived than any triumphal arch or senator's speech ever could. Sites like Herculaneum, preserved under volcanic material rather than the slower decay affecting most Roman ruins, have offered particularly rich drain deposits, the speed of that catastrophic burial locking organic material in place before it could fully decompose. Researchers there have reconstructed remarkably detailed pictures of what a single neighborhood actually consumed across an average season, information far more precise than any surviving written record from the period could offer. There's something quietly moving in all this, if you sit with it a moment. The Romans who used these latrines, who dropped a coin through a gap in the seat without a second thought, who ate a particular fish or fruit on some forgotten afternoon, never imagined their most mundane, unremarkable moments would eventually become the clearest window future generations had into their actual daily existence. The grand speeches and monuments told the story Rome wanted remembered. The drains told the story that actually happened, quietly, patiently, waiting nearly 2,000 years for someone to finally come looking. Those coins lost through a latrine seat, those parasite eggs preserved in ancient sediment, together paint a more complicated portrait than the one Rome's engineering usually earns in popular memory. It's easy, after everything we've walked through, to come away impressed, and rightly so. But it's worth pausing here, before we close this story, to look honestly at where that impression runs ahead of the actual truth. The popular image of Roman sanitation, the one that circulates in casual conversation and simplified histories, tends toward a kind of quiet exaggeration. Flushing toilets, some assume. Sophisticated understanding of hygiene, others imagine, decades or centuries ahead of anywhere else in the ancient world. Neither claim survives close scrutiny particularly well. What Rome actually built was impressive in scale and ambition, certainly, but it operated on principles far cruder than the word advanced tends to suggest. Consider the water itself, moving through those latrine channels beneath the public benches. This wasn't a targeted, controlled flush arriving with each individual use, the way modern plumbing responds to a single action. It was a continuous, passive flow, running whether anyone needed it in that particular moment or not, dependent entirely on whatever volume happened to be available from the aqueduct supply or bathhouse runoff feeding it. During drier periods, or in less prosperous districts where water allocation ran thinner, that flow could slow considerably, sometimes to something barely more than a trickle, leaving waste to linger far longer than the system's better moments might suggest. The Cloaca Maxima itself, for all its genuine engineering achievement, functioned essentially as an open channel dressed up with stone covering, not a treatment system in any real sense. It moved waste from one place to another, from the crowded city center to the Tiber, without processing or purifying anything along the way. The river simply absorbed what the city could no longer hold, diluting it, carrying it downstream toward communities that had no say in what arrived on their stretch of water. Rome solved its own immediate problem by exporting it, a solution elegant from the perspective of the city itself, considerably less so from the perspective of whoever lived downstream. Picture the actual texture of daily contact with this system, stripped of any romanticized engineering pride. A resident using a public latrine still sat directly above open, unfiltered waste, separated by nothing more than a stone seat and whatever gap in flow happened to exist at that particular hour. The shared sponge, as we discussed several chapters back, carried genuine risk from one user to the next, a detail entirely at odds with any modern notion of hygienic infrastructure. Hand washing, where it existed at all, remained inconsistent, dependent on whether a particular latrine happened to include a nearby basin, and even then, unconnected to any real understanding of why washing mattered beyond simple cleanliness of appearance. There's a broader pattern worth naming here, one that extends well past Roman sanitation specifically. Impressive engineering and genuine understanding are not the same achievement, and history sometimes lets one stand in for the other in our collective memory. Rome moved enormous volumes of water and waste with remarkable technical skill, solving the mechanical half of an enormous civic problem. But the biological half, the actual relationship between waste, contamination, and illness, remained entirely outside their grasp, and would stay outside humanity's grasp for many centuries beyond the empire's eventual collapse. This doesn't diminish what Rome accomplished so much as it clarifies what that accomplishment actually was. A city of over 1 million people, functioning at that scale without any of it, would likely have collapsed under its own waste within a matter of years. What Rome built prevented that collapse, extended the city's viability considerably beyond what would otherwise have been possible, and represented genuine, hard-won progress against the alternative of no system at all. It simply wasn't the sanitized, sophisticated vision that modern imagination sometimes projects backward onto it, filtered through centuries of assuming that anything built in stone must have been built with modern understanding quietly folded in alongside it. The truth sits somewhere more interesting than either the myth of Roman genius or a dismissal of what they achieved. A civilization solved an enormous, genuine problem using the tools and knowledge available to it, imperfectly, unevenly, with consequences it couldn't foresee, and in doing so, kept a 1 million-person city functioning for centuries longer than it otherwise could have. That's neither triumph nor failure. It's simply what human ingenuity, working at the edge of its own understanding, has always looked like. That honest reckoning we just walked through, the space between Rome's genuine achievement and its quieter limitations, brings us naturally to the end of this particular journey beneath the city's streets. We began in a marsh, centuries before anyone imagined columns or empires, and we've followed that same patient current all the way through to a river absorbing the burden of 1 million lives, carrying it onward into a history that would eventually forget most of the individual hands who'd made the whole system possible. Think back, for a moment, to where we started. A single hut on a hillside, a family choosing a patch of ground set slightly apart, no plan yet, no vision of what this small, unremarkable decision might eventually grow into. From that quiet beginning came channels, then covered sewers, then public benches where strangers became, briefly, something like companions. An entire civilization's relationship with something as basic, as universal, as human waste, shaped by centuries of small adjustments, each one responding to whatever problem the last adjustment had left unsolved. There's a particular kind of comfort in stories like this one, if you let yourself settle into it. Not comfort in the sense of triumph or grand achievement, but something quieter. The comfort of knowing that ordinary problems, the unglamorous, unphotographed difficulties of daily survival, have always occupied as much of human attention and ingenuity as anything more celebrated. The senators debating policy in the forum, the engineers who built the Cloaca Maxima, the aediles patrolling for careless window dumpers, the elderly man finding quiet company on a latrine bench, all of them, in their own way, were simply trying to make an impossibly large, crowded city just slightly more livable than it would otherwise have been. Somewhere in the details we've walked through tonight, a coin lost through a latrine seat 2,000 years ago, a shared sponge rinsed patiently in flowing water, a shrine to fortune tucked into a stone wall, there's a kind of quiet reassurance. The people who lived inside this system were not so different from anyone listening now. They complained about smells. They found comfort in small rituals. They built what they could with what they understood, and left the rest to luck, to habit, to whatever quiet faith helped them move through an uncertain world. As the evening settles fully now, and the last of Rome's daily rhythm fades into imagined stillness, picture the city one final time. Lamps dimming in windows above narrow streets. The cloaca maxima moving steadily beneath the sleeping forum, patient as it has always been, indifferent to the empire it will eventually outlast. Somewhere below a quiet courtyard, a well sits undisturbed until morning. Somewhere across the city, a public latrine stands empty, its bench cool and silent until the next citizen arrives to take a seat among strangers once more. Let that be the last image you carry tonight. Not grandeur, not conquest, not marble or triumph, but simply a city breathing quietly through its most unremarkable moments, the same slow current running beneath everything, carrying the ordinary weight of ordinary lives toward wherever it was always meant to go. Rest now. There's another story waiting, whenever you're ready for it.